I applaud your vigilance and fortitude to come back after dinner. Welcome to the evening session and the last session of the day. So tonight we have Eleonore Stump from St. Louis University, and she is going to speak on the problem of evil and the history of peoples. Think Amalek. And then the comments will be from Paul Draper from Purdue.
Writing about Benjamin Netanyahu in the New York Times, May 17, 2009, the journalist Jeffrey Goldberg says, quote, "I recently asked one of his advisors to gauge for me the depth of Mr. Netanyahu's anxiety about Iran. His answer, think Amalek. Amalek is Hebrew for existential threat," unquote. It is amazing that so many centuries after the battles between the Amalekites and the Israelites, the biblical stories of the Amalekites should still have so much influence. But if the biography of any one human being is a complicated affair, the histories of peoples are very much more tangled. In this case, although the Amalekites and the Israelites are ancestral enemies, in fact, in the biblical stories, both peoples are part of the same family. The progenitor of the Amalekites was born to one of the sons of Esau, the twin brother of Jacob, who was one of the ancestors of the whole Israelite people. So in the stories, the Amalekite people and the Israelite people are cousins of a sort, at least in their origins. In this paper, I want to look at one episode in the enduring history of these two related peoples, namely the story told in 1 Samuel of Samuel and the Amalekites. This story raises the problem of evil in a particular and powerful way that prompts loathing of religion in some people, as we've heard already in this conference. And it's more difficult to deal with than the usual examples illustrating the problem of evil, at least partly because the protagonists in the story include whole peoples. I'm going to deviate from the text that you have, the long version that you have. I have to because I have time limits for the reading draft. Where the deviation is small, I won't say. Where it's large, I'll clue you. The story's too long to reproduce here, given the time limits for the papers, although you have it in your long version. But here's what I take to be the most salient bits of the story. In the story, through the prophet Samuel, God commands Saul and the Israelite people to attack the Amalekite people and to kill all of them, together with all of their animals. Saul and the Israelite people carry out this divinely commanded plan, except that they save Agag, the king of the Amalekites, and all the best of the animals. At that point, a very angry Samuel returns to tell Saul that since Saul has rejected God's command, God has rejected Saul as king. And after going on for a bit, the story finishes with Samuel himself killing Agag. So that's the story. Now I'm skipping the section on reactions to the story and resuming on page 44. This story, as I said, is a good example of stories in the Hebrew Bible that prompt outrage in many contemporary readers. The story presents God, a God who is supposed to be good, as commanding the Israelites to kill every human being among the Amalekites, including the children, and to slaughter all the animals. Why shouldn't we, that is, why shouldn't I, reject this story as non-veridical and morally repellent? In this paper, I want to approach this question by doing a thought experiment. I want to consider a putatively possible world which is very similar to the actual world and which includes the existence of evil, but in which the central claims of Christianity are true. I say putatively possible because I recognize that in virtue of the problem of evil, some people think there is no such possible world. With this putatively possible world briefly and partially described, I want to ask whether the story of Samuel and the Amalekites could be true in a world of that sort. In the putatively possible world of the thought experiment, there is an omniscient, omnipotent, perfectly good God who created the world and governs it. Human beings are also created by God, and they are everlasting. They do not cease to exist at bodily death. God loves everything that he has made, and he desires all human beings to be united to him in love forever. But because human beings have free will in some libertarian sense, even God cannot unilaterally bring about union between himself and a human person. For there to be such union, a human person has to be willing to be united to God. His will has to be in accord with the will of a perfectly good God. Everything that happens in this world happens in accordance with God's will, at least in the sense that God permits it, even if he permits it only in light of what human beings themselves will. Finally, in this world, there is an objective moral standard for human beings. That standard is in accordance with God's will, and God communicates it to human beings by one means or another. Among other things, this divinely willed and communicated moral standard forbids murder as incompatible with God's will. It also mandates a certain standard of care for animals. So that's the briefly, partially described, putatively possible world. Can the story of Samuel and the Amalekites be made to fit into a world of this sort? Now I'm skipping the section on identification of the story and resuming on page 45. To answer this question, it helps to reflect carefully on what the particular problems of the story about the Amalekites are supposed to be. What exactly is the matter with this story if we try to read it as literally true in the world I have described? At first glance, the answer seems easy and obvious. Someone might suppose that the God of the putatively possible world in the thought experiment could not will the death of a child or of any human being at any age. But clearly this is not right. In the world as I have described it, every human being who dies, everyone without exception, dies because that death is in accordance with God's will, either God's active will or God's permissive will. Without doubt, the death of human beings in general, and the death of children in particular, raises the problem of evil. Certainly it does. Of course it does. But here's the thing, the problem of evil can't be addressed adequately in passing in one short paper whose main focus is something other than the problem of evil in general. And I want the questions for the thought experiment at issue in this paper to focus not on the problem of evil in general, but on what is particular to the story of Samuel and the Amalekites. The death of human beings is not something particular to the story about the Amalekites. So, for the sake of focusing the thought experiment, I want to add to the description of the putatively possible world of the thought experiment the stipulation that God has some morally sufficient reason for allowing the suffering of human beings and of animals, and that the morally sufficient reason includes benefits that defeat their suffering. On this stipulation, each sufferer is the protagonist of his own life story, and in that story his suffering is defeated by the benefits that accrue to him from his suffering. In making this stipulation, I am granting at the outset that nothing in this paper provides any help with the problem of evil in general. And here in my own defense, I want to say that I do have something to say about the problem of evil in general. And a 700-page book on that subject is now in production at Oxford, so I'm not really skipping it, I'm just skipping it here. For purposes of this paper, I want to examine the problems specific to the story about the Amalekites then, and not the problem of evil as a whole. Now I'm skipping the rest of this section and the next and resuming on page 47. There's a lot more that needs to be said about worries raised by the sufferings of the Amalekite people and their animals. And in the longer version of the paper that you have, I tried to remark on some of it. But I want to leave all of it to one side here in the interest of highlighting what seems to me a more difficult kind of worry that is raised by things that are specific to the story. Even if in the story what God commands the Israelite people doesn't count as murder on their part, and there's a paragraph in your text that says why I think not, nonetheless, it does seem that there is something morally deplorable in God's commanding the Israelite people to do this killing. It seems that there is something morally corrupting for the Israelites in their engaging in the wholesale killing of human beings and animals. And it is not compatible with God's goodness to will the moral corruption of human beings. So even if the death of all the Amalekites and the death of their animals were somehow compatible with the existence of a good God, as I have stipulated that it is in the putatively possible world of the thought experiment, it seems that God's actively engaging the Israelite people in killing the Amalekites and their animals couldn't be. But this objection to the story ought to precipitate a question that the story should have raised in any case. If in the story God's purpose is that the Amalekite people cease to exist as a people, then why doesn't God himself bring about that end? In the putatively possible world of my thought experiment, God is omnipotent and omniscient. So he could bring about the end of the Amalekites simply by willing that they not exist anymore. Even in the world of the biblical stories, the God of the stories can bring about by himself the end of the existence of a large group of people. Think, for example, of the destruction of the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. As far as that goes, think of the story of Noah's flood. In the story of Noah's flood, God in effect makes a new beginning in human history by the cultural analog of an autologous bone marrow transplant. From the infected culture of post-fall human beings, God selects one small group that seems as free of post-fall moral evil as human beings ever get. God destroys the evil peoples and multiplies the morally healthy group when they have been reintroduced into the environment. So in the world of these biblical stories, it's possible for God to use the forces of nature to end the existence of a whole group of people. In the world of my thought experiment, God doesn't even need to use the forces of nature. An omnipotent God can bring about the end of the existence of a people just by willing it. Furthermore, as the story of Samuel and the Amalekites make clear, if eradicating the Amalekites is the end God is trying to achieve, then causing the Amalekite people to cease to exist by means of commanding the Israelite people to kill them, that's not a good way to bring it about. It's part of the story that Saul willfully fails to do what he was commanded to do to bring it about. In fact, although the story seems to suggest that in the end none of the Amalekites survive, the Amalekites are again a fighting force worth worrying about only a few years later in the ongoing biblical narrative. Saul's successor, David, returns to his home in Ziklag to find that the Amalekites have burned the entire town and kidnapped all the women and children in it. If ending the existence of the Amalekite people was God's purpose, then God could have achieved his purpose better and more reliably by bringing it about himself, rather than commanding Saul and the Israelite people to do it for him. And here it's worth stopping to reflect more generally on the things that God consigns to human agency in the biblical stories and in the putatively possible world of my thought experiment. Consider, for example, in the biblical stories, the entire system of law and the enforcement of law. On this law, which in the stories God gave the Israelite people, if one person steals a sheep from another person, the community in which the thief lives, or the appropriate officials of that community, have to see to it that the thief gives back 4 sheep to the person from whom he stole. If one person murders another, the community or its officials have to put the murderer to death. And now a problem analogous to that posed by the story of Samuel and the Amalekites should occur to us. If God wants the prohibition of theft and murder to be enforced, why doesn't God just do the enforcing himself? Think just about the requirement of capital punishment for cases of murder. God could easily make it the case that anyone who committed murder inevitably died himself very soon afterwards. In the world of the thought experiment, as in the world of the biblical stories, God doesn't need human beings to enforce these laws for him. Furthermore, here too, it is clear that if the end God wants is the enforcement of the law, this end is much less reliably and successfully achieved by God's using human beings as agents to bring about this end. And clearly this is only the beginning. If God does not like theft and murder and seeks to suppress them in human society, achieving this aim by means of human enforcement of the law and punishment for its violation seems a particularly poor means to the end. The process has the very bad consequence that some human beings, the victims of theft or murder, suffer before the means meant to suppress theft and murder are used. The process is also highly unreliable, since it requires human beings to care about theft and murder, to be willing to do what it takes to find thieves and murderers, and to be committed to imposing the divinely mandated punishments just on the guilty. It also needs human beings to be successful in their efforts to do these things. Furthermore, just as in the case of Samuel and the Amalekites, there is also a worry about the effects on the people enforcing the law and imposing its punishments on those who violate it. It is possible that human beings who impose punishments will be corrupted by imposing them. People who oppose capital punishment worry about the effects on a society that finds capital punishment acceptable. Pacifists think that any willingness to engage in war corrupts the people who accept participating in such violence. Obviously, if God's aim is to suppress theft and murder in human society, there is a much better way for him to accomplish this aim than by means of a system of laws and punishments. Because he is omnipotent, by himself, without any human help, God could make it impossible for one human being to murder another or steal from another. There are myriad ways, limited only by our imagination to conceive them, by which God might do so. For example, he might simply make it a rule of the universe that human beings can't do such things. If he can make a rule of the universe which has the result that elementary particles are entangled, then he could make a rule of the universe which limits human behavior in this way. And contrary to what is sometimes claimed, God could do so without violating or abrogating human free will. A person could still freely will to steal or freely will to murder, even if he couldn't carry out successfully what he willed. Coveting and hating helplessly are not uncommon even in our world where theft and murder are possible. So if we understand God's aims as the punishment of violators of the law, the suppression of moral wrongdoing, or the destruction of the Amalekite people, what we would have to say is that God has picked highly inefficacious ways to bring about his aims. But on the thought experiment I'm doing, this conclusion is a reductio of the hypothesis that these are God's aims. That's because in the putatively possible world of the thought experiment, God is omniscient, omnipotent, and perfectly good. And so, choosing very poor means to achieve his aims is not possible for God. This conclusion could be seen as an argument for rejecting the story. But it could also be seen as an argument for rejecting this interpretation of the story. So for the sake of keeping the thought experiment going, suppose we consider whether there isn't an interpretation of the story that makes God's primary aim something other than the eradication and the punishment of the Amalekite people. I propose to begin looking for such an interpretation by asking what it is about human agency that makes God value it, even at the costs it brings with it. Why would God want war on the part of the Israelite people to be the means of ending the existence of the Amalekite people? For that matter, why would God want his laws about theft and murder to be enforced by human agency? Why would God even issue laws about human behavior? Why not just do everything himself? Put that way, of course, the question suggests its answer. In the world of my thought experiment, what God wants ultimately, as regards human beings, is union with them. For a union of wills between a perfectly good God and a human person, however, the human person needs to have a perfectly good will too. And clearly a will in this condition is not so easy to come by for human beings. It won't be easy to come by for omnipotent God either. That's because if God unilaterally determines a human will to be perfectly good, then the will in that human being is God's will, not the human person's. And in that case, union is precluded, not achieved. For union, two persons with two wills and two minds are required. So one reason for God's valuing human agency is that it is necessary for union between God and human beings. Thinking about God's attitude towards human agency in this way suggests another explanation of God's practice of issuing laws for human behavior and of leaving it to human beings to enforce those laws. For a people to adopt a law requires it to accept a certain standard of behavior. And for it to enforce that law requires it to have a commitment to the standard it accepts and to the person on whose authority the standard rests. On this view, one point of God's giving human beings laws and leaving the enforcement of those laws to human beings is not the effect of the system on the violators of the law, but the effect of the system on the people entrusted with enforcing the law. At the point in the biblical story at which God commands the destruction of the Amalekite people, the Israelite people is early in its history of formation as a people with a law. And so we might bring to bear on the story of the Amalekites considerations analogous to those about the divinely given law and the enforcement of that law. Just as in the world of the biblical stories and in the world of my thought experiment, there's a point to making human beings responsible for a law God gives them. So it is not implausible to suppose that making the Israelite people responsible for God's eradicating the Amalekite people brings home to the Israelite people the moral and religious importance of God's judgment and the importance of the Israelite people's commitment to God. Saul is the first king of the Israelite people, who are at that point in the transition from being a loosely knit aggregate of tribes to being one people bound together in a nation. Their short history between their coming out of Egypt and their coming together as a nation under a king is marked by reiterated episodes of alienation from God and disregard of the moral and spiritual practices God enjoined on them during the Exodus. Here, at the beginning of their existence as a nation, It may be that God commands them to be the agents of the destruction of the Amalekite people, to bring home to them in this drastic way the importance of their relationship to God and the importance of God's judgments, including the divinely ordained practices that distinguish the Israelite people from the surrounding peoples. Thinking about the story in this way helps to explain why God requires the Israelites to kill all the animals of the Amalekites. Animals represent wealth in this culture. If the Israelite people take the Amalekite animals for their own use, any use, even for use as sacrifices, then they begin to blur the distinction between acting as officially sanctioned executioners, as it were, and acting as brigands. And this way of interpreting the story, God commands the killing of all the Amalekite animals so that the Israelites do not make a profit from victory over the Amalekites. For the Israelite people to refrain from pillaging their defeated enemies is for them to be committed in a way they will feel to acting for God's purposes and not their own. Now I'm going to skip the next two paragraphs. But what about the issue of moral corruption? Moral corruption is a matter of making someone morally worse than he otherwise would be. And in principle, one people can certainly be corrupted by going to war to destroy another people it takes to be its enemy. But a lot depends on the condition of the people engaged in the fighting. In the world of the stories, as evidenced by biblical text, and in the ancient Western world in general, as attested by such sources as we have in history and poetry, unending tribal warfare marked by savage practices is the rule in the time when God gives the Israelite people the command to destroy the Amalekites. In the period immediately before the story about Samuel and the Amalekites, the Israelites attacked the Amalekites on their own authority, not God's. In this same period, they also fought with the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Edomites, and the Philistines, all of whom at some point also aggressed against the Israelites. As for the surrounding peoples, when the Ammonites initiate an attack against one Israelite community, the Israelite people of that community cave. They offer to surrender without fighting and to serve the Ammonites exactly as the Ammonites wish. But the Ammonites are willing to accept that offer only if the Israelites first allow them to gouge out the right eye of every Israelite human being in that community. So it's less clear than it might have initially seemed that in the world of these stories, God's command to destroy the Amalekites risks the moral corruption of the Israelite people. Another way of reading the story about Samuel and the Amalekites, then, is to see God's aims as focused on the effects of the fighting on the Israelite people rather than on the Amalekite people. I do not mean to say that in the world of the biblical stories any more than in the world of my thought experiment, God cares only about the Israelite people. I mean only that the books of the Hebrew Bible have the Israelite people and their growth in relationship to God as the main concern of the story. It isn't possible to tell everything in one story. I also do not mean, and it is also not part of my interpretation of the story of Samuel and the Amalekites, that in that story God uses the suffering of the Amalekites only for the sake of bringing any kind of benefit to the Israelites. In the world of my thought experiment, God loves all human persons, and he doesn't use the suffering of any human beings solely as a means to some good for others. In the world of my thought experiment, in some story we don't have, another one of the Abrahamic peoples, the Amalekites, and not the Israelites, are the main protagonists, and the point of their suffering is the provision of benefits for them. On this interpretation of the story, however, another perplexity arises analogous to the one I raised for the interpretation of the story in which the point of the fighting is primarily the effect on the Amalekites. If God's purpose in the story of Saul and of Samuel and the Amalekites, if his purpose has to do with the formation of the Israelites as a people growing in their ability to be united to him, it seems that his plan is as unreliable and unsuccessful as I said that plan would be if its aim were its effects on the Amalekites. That's because very shortly after this, the Israelite people is itself immersed in all the practices God has condemned on the part of all the surrounding peoples with whom God has commanded the Israelite people to fight. So it seems as if on the interpretation I've just given of the story of Samuel and the Amalekites, God's plan is no more efficacious or successful in achieving God's ends than it was on the interpretation of the story I was trying to put aside. Here it's worth thinking again of the other cases I mentioned in which God requires human agency. God's giving of the law prohibiting theft and murder, for example, and is requiring human enforcement of that law. Murder and theft were certainly not extinguished among the Israelite people by this means. Or think again about the story of Noah and the flood, which I said was the moral and spiritual equivalent of an autologous bone marrow transplant. In the case of Noah's flood, the procedure was a definite failure. The old moral disease returned almost immediately. The remission purchased by the flood was very short-lived. If God was hoping for a morally better world by means of killing off the morally diseased peoples of the antediluvian world, he was sadly mistaken. And now in the world of my thought experiment, we have reached another reductio. The God of my thought experiment couldn't be sadly mistaken. He's omniscient. And as omniscient, he will know that bringing a flood and eradicating all but a few good people will not solve the moral problem with the human species. Mutatis mutandis, the same point applies with regard to the God of the biblical stories. In the world of the biblical stories, God can predict things hundreds of years in advance, as when he tells Abraham that his descendants will be slaves for 400 years. So presumably the God of the biblical stories can also know what will happen in the life of a people 1 or 2 generations hence. Even in the world of the biblical stories, then, God can know that these plans will fail. So why would God bring about a flood? Why would God give the law or ask the Israelite people to enforce it? Why would he command the eradication of the Amalekite people? In each of these cases, what looks like a plan to grow a people into a moral and spiritual condition that will enable them to be united with God turns out to be a failure. But this failure is one that could not be a surprise to the omniscient God of my thought experiment or to the God of the biblical stories either. It could, however, be a surprise to us. That is, for each of the things God does, start over with a new human people after the flood, set rules for the behavior of the Israelite people, get the Israelite people to be enforcers of those rules, command the Israelite people to act as officially sanctioned executioners against the whole people of the Amalekites. For each of these things, we might have thought that one or more of these plans would be an efficacious way to cure the moral disease that seems to infect all human beings everywhere. So here's a different way of understanding what God is doing in stories such as these in the Hebrew Bible. He's forming a people by showing them what will not work to cure them of what has to be healed in them in order for them to be united to God as a people. This way of thinking about God's plans yields another interpretation of the story about the Amalekites. On this interpretation, the story of Samuel and the Amalekites is one episode in a chronicle of the birth and ongoing formation of the Israelite people, in which God's primary aim is to form this people for union with himself. In the world of my thought experiment, there is also another story, only one which we don't have, whose main subject is the formation of the Amalekite people. And in this story, the suffering of the Amalekites at the hands of the Israelites has a role to play in the relationship of this people to God during the time of their existence as a people. In the chronicle of God's formation of the Israelite people, God recurrently puts in place plans that might be thought to provide a cure of the moral disease that makes union with a good God impossible. Each of these plans is produced, shown to fail, and then abandoned. Noah's flood is followed by a different kind of attempt at the reproduction of a good human people. God develops a close relationship with Abraham and then builds Abraham's offspring into a particular people covenanted with God. By the time of Abraham's great-grandchildren, this strategy already looks very unsuccessful. Next, God lets the burgeoning Israelite people become enslaved in Egypt, and then he frees them in a floridly dramatic rescue, which includes giving them laws about how to live and punishments for violating those laws. But the people are hardly out of Egypt before this strategy begins to look highly unsuccessful too. At this point, God commands the killing of the Amalekite people and others as well, as another attempt to impact the Israelite people, a more shrill and strenuous attempt to accomplish what requiring Israelites to enforce the law was meant to achieve. But the immediate aftermath is marked just by civil war among the Israelite people and lamentable evil on the part of its rulers. After this, under Solomon, there's a period of peace and prosperity for the Israelite people, but prosperity is no more a cure for the human tendency to evil than any of the other divine strategies were. And so on and on. The chronicle continues in the production of new plans for the establishment of a good, just, loving people that can be united with a perfectly good God. As each plan is seen to fail, it's abandoned and succeeded by another one. There is no second recurrence of a flood. There is no new and better law given to the people. There is no second set of divine commands to the Israelites for the eradication of some other people. There's no second Solomon. Each of these plans for the formation of a people close to God, able to be united with him, each of these plans is shown to be unsuccessful, and for that reason is also not attempted again. In the end, all these plans fail, in the sense that none of them constitutes the cure for the human tendency to evil or results in the formation of a people cured of that tendency. Taken together, however, these plans do succeed in another way. God's global plan in the overarching chronicle of the formation of the Israelite people involves the production of many short-lived plans doomed to failure. But the global plan does contribute to forming a people who can be united with God. That's because learning what won't work is sometimes an essential preliminary in the process of the discovery of what will work and of the willingness to accept it. We are familiar with this sort of phenomenon on a much smaller scale in the lives of individual human beings, where the stakes and the suffering are correspondingly smaller. Sometimes a person is not willing to accept what is necessary for the regeneration of his life until everything else has been tried and found to fail. In the overarching chronicle, it is God's global plan, consisting of a series of localized failures. It's the global plan that's meant to be successful. So here's what I want to say in conclusion. In this paper, I've done nothing to address the problem of evil in general or the problem of evil as it's raised by the suffering of the Amalekites and the animals in the story. For the sake of the thought experiment, I have just stipulated that in the putatively possible world of the thought experiment, there is some morally sufficient reason for God to allow the suffering of human beings and animals. If in the actual world there is no such reason, then of course we don't need to worry about the story of Samuel and the Amalekites. There are weightier and more pressing reasons for rejecting theism than this story. If it can be shown on the grounds of the problem of evil that theism has to be rejected, then this story and others like it lose much of their interest. So in order to consider what there is about the story that is interesting and that raises the problem of evil in a way peculiar to the story, it helps to bracket the problem of evil in its general form, as I've done in the thought experiment. On first reflection, it seems as if there are only two options as regards the story of Samuel and the Amalekites. Either reject the story in one simple or more complicated way, as making false claims about commands by God, or else accept those claims as true, but at the cost of giving up deeply entrenched moral intuitions. But the thought experiment shows that these are not the only options for dealing with the story. On the reading of the story in the thought experiment, the story is part of a much larger narrative having to do with the raising of a people. Because we are a child-centered culture, we think a lot about the raising of human beings, one human being at a time. But we're not much accustomed to thinking about what it would be to form a people, or even the whole human species, over many centuries. This process is much harder to understand, but it shares some features with child raising. We take one important goal for child raising, to be getting children to desire on their own what is good. What is good as regards nutrition, the life of the mind, interpersonal relations, social justice, and many other things as well. We understand that it is not easy to raise a child to turn out this way. It can't be accomplished just with lessons and lectures. It requires the exercise of agency on the part of the children and their own experience of what makes failure in human life. Plainly, forming a people or the whole human species with an analogous goal is even more difficult and complicated. The stories of the Hebrew Bible form one larger narrative about a process of formation of this sort for one people. When the story of Samuel and the Amalekites is seen within the context of the larger narrative, then its troubling features look different too. So interpreted, in my view, the story can be woven into the putatively possible world of my thought experiment. In the larger narrative, which is the context for the story about the Amalekites, God values human agency not because, or not only because, the human agents bring about something in the world that God wants to have accomplished. Rather, God values it at least in part because of its effects on the agents. In the miserable process of formation through experience, one of the things a people can learn is what will not work to make a people just, good, and loving. If the story of Samuel and the Amalekites is not to be just rejected, then I think that this is a more promising way to read it. At any rate, it seems to me that this way of thinking about the story would be helpful for Benjamin Netanyahu. And I'm done. Thanks.
Okay, comments by Paul Draper?
I think some unauthorized reprinting of my comments are being distributed right now. I don't know who all those people are that are passing them out. I'd like to begin by thanking the Lord for giving me the opportunity to participate in this conference. Of course, not unlike the story of Samuel and the Amalekites, this expression of gratitude, though sincere, should not be taken literally in every detail. Specifically, I use the term the Lord to refer not to God, but to a significantly less holy trinity that we all know to exist, namely the three Mikes who organized this conference. Mike the Murray, Mike the Ray, and Mike the Holy Bergman. Holy there is spelled W-H-O-L-L-Y. I would also like to thank Eleonore Stump for her willingness to stick her neck out tonight. Well, again, not literally, on what is obviously an extremely difficult problem for someone with her religious beliefs. Professor Stump's approach to the issue of the character of the biblical God is as nuanced as it is thought-provoking. She refuses to ask how we should interpret the story of Samuel and the Amalekites, because she recognizes that the plausibility of an interpretation is relative to the beliefs of the interpreter. For example, for Christians who believe the Bible to be not revelation itself, but just a fallible human report of revelation, it would be foolish to take seriously the idea that a morally perfect God literally commanded the Israelites to slaughter the Amalekites. This is why Stump conducts a thought experiment. She asks a question not about the actual world, but about a putatively possible world in which the central claims of her particular version of Orthodox Christianity, which I will call Eleonorean Christianity, are true. In this way, she hopes to enable us to see the story of the Amalekites through her eyes, and thus to appreciate why her interpretation of the story is plausible for someone with beliefs like hers. Second, Stump wisely refuses to discuss problems of evil that are not uniquely biblical, such as the problem of why God allows horrific suffering, even if those problems are raised by the story. Instead, she limits her attention to problems like why God commands one people to destroy another, problems that Eleonorean Christians face only because they believe that the Bible is divinely inspired. Taking these nuances into account, we can describe Stump's project as follows. She wants to offer an interpretation of the story of Samuel and the Amalekites, and she wants to make at least three claims about that interpretation. First, she wants to claim that her interpretation takes the story to be literally true in its entirety. We can call this the literality claim. Second, she wants to claim that accepting her interpretation does not require Eleonorean Christians to reject any deeply entrenched moral beliefs. Let's call this the morality claim. And third, she wants to claim that her interpretation of the story is plausible for Eleonorean Christians. Let's call this the plausibility claim. After briefly summarizing Stump's interpretation, I will challenge all three of these claims about it. In so doing, I will also implicitly challenge a fourth claim that she wants to make about her interpretation, namely, that it solves all of the uniquely biblical problems of evil raised by the story. A key component of Stump's interpretation is that the purpose of God's command to exterminate Amalek is not to punish Amalek for what it did to Israel when Israel came out of Egypt. For that would involve punishing innocent Amalekites, not to mention their animals, and so would be unjust. Instead, God's purpose, or at least one of God's purposes, is to form Israel, the people or nation, interestingly, not the individual Israelites, for union with himself. The obvious objection is that if this was God's purpose, then God failed miserably, for the Bible reports that Israel turned away from God shortly after the destruction of Amalek. How could an Eleonorean God, a God who is both omnipotent and omniscient, be so inept? Stump responds that this and many other apparent failures reported in the Bible might themselves be required for successfully forming Israel for union with God. The Israelite people might need to learn by firsthand experience what doesn't work in order to be willing to freely accept what does. Stump's first claim about this interpretation is that it takes the story of Samuel and the Amalekites to be literally true in every detail. Part of what she means by this is that, on her interpretation, the entire story, including its theological elements, is a historical narrative and a perfectly accurate one at that. I agree that on her interpretation this is so, but I still want to challenge the literality claim. To begin to appreciate why, consider what, according to Samuel, are God's own words. Quote, "I have made reckoning of what Amalek did to Israel, that he set against him on the way as he was coming up from Egypt. Now, go and strike down Amalek, and put under the ban everything that he has. You shall not spare him, and you shall put to death man and woman, infant and suckling, ox and sheep, camel and donkey." In this passage, God states a rationale for his command to exterminate Amalek that is very different from the rationale Stump attributes to God. Of course, the passage doesn't explicitly say that what Amalek did to Israel a few generations before Samuel was born explains what God now wants Israel to do to Amalek. But an Eleonorean God would realize that such an interpretation of his words, as reported by Samuel, is very natural, to say the least, and not just for unsophisticated readers like me. More than one of the experts I have consulted about translation issues concerning this passage claim that the Hebrew word translated here as "have made reckoning of," and in many other English translations as "have remembered," or even better in the translation that Elvin Planiga read, which had it as "will punish," and I guess that's in a few translations. All that supports my point. Long story short, concerning that particular word that gets translated in those ways, if a person or people is wicked and God remembers or makes a reckoning of that wickedness, then bad things are going to happen to that person, and they're going to happen because of that person's wickedness. The suggestion of punishment is very strong, and the suggestion of an explanatory connection between the person's wickedness and the bad things that happen to that person is irresistible. Of course, it is compatible with taking the story literally to claim that God did not tell Samuel all of her reasons for her command. But it is not compatible with the literal reading to imply, as Stump's interpretation does, that God's own explanation for her actions is woefully and needlessly incomplete and seriously misleading. If the reasons for God's command that God wants to reveal to us in the story of Samuel and the Amalekites have nothing to do with punishment, have more to do with Israel than with Amalek, and have more to do with Amalek's present or even potential future transgressions than with Amalek's past transgressions, then the God of the story did an extraordinarily poor job of explaining his command. I conclude that Stump's interpretation does not really take the story literally, especially given the Eleonorean Christian view that the Bible is God's revelation, and so presumably successfully reveals something, especially when it quotes God. Stump might respond that to take the story in its entirety to be literally true, one need only accept as true every sentence in the story and every sentence that one knows to be logically or semantically entailed by those sentences. If this is her position, then that would explain why she feels free to suggest in one place, although this isn't part of her official interpretation, that perhaps the Amalekite children didn't suffer when they and their families were slaughtered. After all, she points out, the story doesn't explicitly say that they did suffer, and an omnipotent God could certainly prevent their suffering. One wonders, though, why such an interesting and important part of the history of the event would be omitted. It's not as if the authors, or author with a capital A, of the Bible was generally reticent to report miracles. Further, exegesis of this sort appears to lead to absurdity. For example, why stop with the children? Why not say that perhaps none of the Amalekites and none of their animals suffered? Indeed, perhaps the whole experience for both Israelite soldiers and the Amalekites was one of pure joy. An omnipotent God could certainly make this so, and nothing in the Bible explicitly denies that this was so. Add to that a happy afterlife for all involved, and one might conclude problem solved. What is wrong with this, of course, is that such an interpretation is utterly implausible, even for an Eleonorean Christian. And part of the reason that it is implausible is that it takes the story literally only in a very impoverished sense of the word literally. This is not to reject all interpretations that do not take the story literally, nor is it to assume that Bible stories wear their meanings or all of their meanings on their sleeves. But it is to reject interpretations that are only pseudo-literal. The second of Stump's three claims is that accepting the interpretation does not require one to reject any deeply entrenched moral beliefs. Before I challenge this claim, I would like to point out how important it is that Stump feels the need to make it. She didn't say much about this in the version of the paper you heard today. It is explicitly discussed, however, in a longer version of the paper. There, Stump says that when we interpret Bible stories like the story of the Amalekites, we should not rethink our moral standards. For example, we should not, quote, for the sake of preserving traditional Jewish and Christian views about Revelation, be prepared to take genocide and the wholesale slaughter of animals as morally permissible, end quote. She continues, quote, there is something loathsome about a willingness to endorse anything at all as long as it lends support to religious practices or beliefs. So Stump is not interested in trying to reconcile Eleanorean Christianity with the literal truth of the story by saying, for example, that murder or genocide could in some cases be permissible, such as when God commands it, or perhaps even when one sincerely and unculpably, though mistakenly, believes that God commands it. That's the scary one. For her, if a Bible story implies that God commanded murder or genocide, then the story must be rejected. And the reason that it must be rejected is that we must not let our commitment to religious tradition or orthodoxy undermine our deeply entrenched moral belief that all human acts of murder and all human acts of genocide are wrong. All human acts of genocide are wrong. I'm really glad she said this, because it must be said in a conference like this, especially after 9/11, especially on 9/11. And it is better that a deeply religious person like Eleonore Stump says it than that some lost soul like me says it. I am convinced, however, that Stump's interpretation fails to meet her own moral standard. For even though the word genocide did not appear until the 1940s, the belief that genocide, when performed by human beings, is always wrong, like the belief that murder, when performed by human beings, is always wrong, is very deeply entrenched, no doubt partly because of the Holocaust. This explains why genocide, like murder, is a serious crime regardless of the circumstances, while the criminality of acts like killing or causing innocents to suffer depends on the circumstances. This also helps to explain why it would generally be considered seriously morally wrong even to defend genocide, let alone to commit it. Although apparently in this conference not everybody agrees with that last sentence. Stump seems to agree with all this. She agrees with it. She explicitly says that she does not want to defend genocide. She seems to think, however, though she doesn't say this explicitly, so I'm reading into it, her paper now, that the Israelites in the story do not commit genocide because they do not decide on their own authority to kill the Amalekites, and so their killing of the Amalekites is not murder. Genocide, however, is the attempt to destroy a people by any means. It is not true by definition that genocide involves murder. It could, for example, involve forced sterilization, or killing because a legitimate political authority orders one to kill. Also, while genocide requires that one act with the intention to destroy a people, it does not require that the motive for one's action be to destroy a people. One's motive might be, for example, to obey what one believes to be a command from God. Thus, in the story of Samuel and the Amalekites, there is no question that God commands the Israelites to commit genocide. This implies that the morality claim is false. For it is among the central claims of Eleanorean Christianity that God is omniscient, that God is morally perfect, and that there is an objective moral standard for human beings that is in accordance with God's will. It follows from these claims that God would never command human beings to do something that is morally wrong for them to do. Hence, Eleanorean Christians are committed to the claim that God would not command the Israelites to do something morally wrong. On Stump's interpretation of the story, however, God commands the Israelites to intentionally destroy a people, that is, to commit genocide. Thus, accepting Stump's interpretation requires Eleanorean Christians to accept that in some circumstances it is not morally wrong for human beings to commit genocide. Therefore, since it is a deeply entrenched moral view that all human acts of genocide are wrong, it follows that accepting Stump's interpretation requires Eleanorean Christians to give up a deeply entrenched moral view. This brings me to the plausibility claim, the claim that while Stump's interpretation may not be plausible for me, or for the Dalai Lama, or for God, Notice the company I keep. It is plausible relative to the belief system of an Eleonorean Christian. My challenges to the literality and morality claims already implicitly challenge the plausibility claim. Indeed, if Stump were to respond to the first of those challenges by saying that the literality claim is true given what she means by the word literal, then I would simply restate that challenge so that it explicitly challenges the plausibility claim. I also reject the plausibility claim, however, for other reasons. One such reason, which is all I have time for tonight, is that an Eleonorean God is omnipotent and omniscient. God even has middle knowledge, according to Stump. Thus, the resources at God's disposal for influencing the Israelite people to turn to God are virtually unlimited. I conclude that even if, because of free will, it is logically possible that an omnipotent, omniscient God has no better way to achieve his goal of forming Israel for union with him than to command Israel to slaughter all of the Amalekite people and all of their animals, no one, including Eleonorean Christians, should find this plausible. It might be possible, but the chance of it being true is exceedingly remote. Thank you.
I'm grateful to Paul Draper for his thoughtful comments. It's impossible in only 5 minutes to do them justice, but here's my best shot at doing what I can in so short a time. Imagine an intelligent being, Max, from a far distant world. In this world, all sentient beings live only in one very large edifice, and outside this edifice, there is nothing at all. These beings are never seriously sick, and they never die. And now suppose that Max is enabled to see a video of events inside a large hospital on Earth where the chief of staff is a surgeon. After seeing the video, Max is filled with moral indignation at the doctors and especially the chief of staff. Any suggestion that the doctors are benevolent towards their patients will be met by Max with incredulity. How can you say that the chief of staff is benevolent, Max will say, when he commands doctors obedient to him to plunge sharp objects into the arms of people to render them helpless, and then requires the doctors to slice these people open with sharp knives? But Max will tell him, the doctors do these things only because the people are sick. Because they're sick, Max will expostulate. Are you going to tell me that just because a person is sick, this sort of suffering is an acceptable punishment for him? No, Max will say, the things done to the people aren't punishments for them. But, Max will say, didn't you just say that the doctors were doing these things to the people because they are sick? Oh, Max will say, the doctors do these things to the people because the people are sick and the doctors are trying to heal them. Heal them, Max will say with disbelief. Heal them. How could slicing a human body open with a knife heal that body? Human beings not only suffer dreadfully from what is done to them in the hospital, but in fact, they also get very much sicker. The video makes that clear. There is some truth in that, Max will say. Sometimes people do get more sick in hospitals, but they're in the hospital in the first place because they are seriously sick, and many of them would die without the care of the doctors. In the hospital, a lot of people are healed, and they leave the hospital to live for a long time more. Leave the hospital, Max will say with scorn. Are you trying to tell me that your interpretation of the hospital video requires you to believe in life outside the building? Why don't you just go on to say that people leave the hospital with joy at being outside the building? Surely even you have to grant that this is a really implausible interpretation of that video. But here is what you can't get past. These doctors are engaging in torture. One of your own reference books in the hospital library defines torture as the infliction of serious physical or psychological suffering, and you can't deny that this is exactly what the doctors are doing. Torture is a terrible moral evil on any acceptable moral theory, and any person who commands it or engages in it is guilty of doing a terrible moral evil. And here's what else you can't deny. In commanding other doctors to torture people, the chief of staff is commanding what must constitute moral corruption or psychic trauma for these doctors. Consider the children. How could anyone hold down a screaming child and do appallingly painful things to it without becoming morally corrupt or deeply traumatized? If a doctor wasn't traumatized by what he was doing, he would be a sadistic bastard. So here are your options, Max will say. Here are your options. You can deny that the video of the hospital tells a literally true story about the chief of staff, or you can acknowledge that the chief of staff is evil. But you can't both take that hospital story as literally true and also accept the chief of staff as morally good. It just isn't possible. But of course, it is possible, as we know. The problem between us and Max doesn't stem from a difference in moral theories. It stems from an enormous difference in worldviews. Add Max's worldview to a story that is part of our world, and this unhappy cross-combination of world and worldview will result in a deeply confused interpretation of the story. In my view, that's the shortest way to explain in a few minutes the basic difference in interpretation between Draper and me.
Okay, I see 4 hands. Where's the mic? Ah, there it is. So right there, and then there, and then there, and then there. Okay. And then there.
Question for Eleanor. One thing that would help me buy your paper, which I think is really terrific, is if you actually could say a little bit about the Amalekite story, not the Israelite story. Are there goods on Eleanorean Christianity that are going to benefit the Amalekites, presumably post-mortem, because they're all supposed to die? Partly it just seems to me perhaps Eleanorean Christianity may not have those goods, but maybe they do. So to really complete the story, it seems to me you have to say a little bit of something about their story too.
Well, I guess I thought I did say something about their story. I said 2 things about it. I mean, in the world of my thought experiment, there's a morally sufficient reason for God to allow suffering, and it includes benefits for the sufferer that defeat the suffering for that sufferer. If there is no such thing, then as I said at the conclusion of my paper, we don't need to bother with a story of the Amalekites. I mean, we have weighty reason for rejecting theism just in the problem of evil. So in the world of my thought experiment, there is a morally sufficient reason for God to allow suffering. And if there's a morally sufficient reason for God to allow suffering, then there is one for him to allow the suffering of the Amalekites too. Now you might say, look, here's the thing, why don't we have the story of the Amalekites too? Why don't we have that story? And the Edomites and the Ammonites and the Amorites and the Philistines and the Canaanites and the Assyrians and the Babylonians. I mean, now we are going to have, you might say, a very pedestrian and boring story, the kind an accountant would want. Let's hear everything about everybody. But it seems to me, in a sense, we don't need that. We need one story, which gives us, as it were, a typological example about how it's supposed to work. And that one story can then stand in for everybody. Unless you want to think that God is the equivalent of a potentate in a small country who cares about his crew and nobody else, then you're going to have to think that God is the God of love, loves everybody. I mean, that's the Judeo-Christian story. And if he loves everybody, then the story of what he does with the Israelites is a type of what he's going to do with everybody. And you can guess at the story of the Amalekites by extrapolating from the story of the Israelites. That's what I would say. Mutatis mutandis.
Here. I saw a lot of hands. I hope I'll get it in the right order. But
this is a question for Eleanor, basically pressing a point Paul was making. It seems like you have to reject one of these three claims, all of which seem plausible. Well, at least all of which you're committed to. So one of them is you say it's wrong. It would be bad to think that God commands genocide, but you do think that God did command, well, in this story at least, that God did command the killing of a whole people. And then the last one that makes those two inconsistent is that genocide just is the killing of a whole group of people. So you have to let one of those go. Which one do you let go?
Well, the last one, that's the whole point about torture in my story about the hospital. If you look up torture in the Oxford English Dictionary, which in my world is the dictionary, you will find that one of the meanings of torture is the infliction of serious physical or psychological suffering. But you know, that can't be the definition of torture. It just can't. Not every reference works that gives a definition of a complicated concept is philosophically adequate, and the OED, however wonderful it is not philosophically adequate for torture. Because if that were right, then we get a lot of things turning out to be torture, which plainly aren't torture. So clearly you have to add something more to the definition of torture, and one of the things I think you would have to add is that, I would say the infliction of serious moral or the infliction of serious physical or psychological suffering is a genus within which torture is a species. But what differentiates the species from other things within the genus is going to have to be something about your motivation. That is, your motivation for doing what you're doing and inflicting this suffering is harm or destruction to the person to whom you are doing it. That's got to be the point of inflicting that suffering. And I would say about genocide, I don't feel licensed or competent to produce a definition of the species for genocide. But I would say that what you've given as the apparent definition for genocide is a genus within which the species will fall. And what will differentiate that species from other things within the genus is similarly something about the motivation. You're going to be doing what you do in order to hurt or undermine or in some other way wreck the thing that you are eradicating. And that is what, in my interpretation of the story, is not going to be God's motivation.
Of course, can I just quickly, of course, I don't, ultimately the dispute here is not then going to be about the definition of genocide. I mean, if she defines it in a different way than me, that's fine. Then the dispute will be about, my claim would be that for human beings anyways, to intentionally destroy a people, just like murder, killing on your own authority, that's always wrong. I mean, you can come up with, really bizarre counterexamples, or you talk about self-defense or something like that, but then, is that really murder? But similarly, to intentionally, I think what we've learned, partly because of the Holocaust, is that intentionally trying to destroy a people, right, is always wrong for human beings.
And I think that's pretty deeply entrenched. So I think ultimately that's where the real disagreement comes down to, not the definition.
Okay, there's there and then there.
This is for Eleanor. Hearing your broader narrative with all the different things that God does, really a plausible way of hearing that is that God is sort of trying out one thing after another and finding out that none of them work too well, though there's a cumulative effect that is positive. Now, I know that you said that, in your view, apparently, God, before he makes each such attempt, knows exactly what the result is going to be. But given that, as I believe is the case, that you don't accept middle knowledge, for God to know those things prior to his decision would induce massive causal circularity. And so I'm wondering if you might be willing to reconsider your rejection of open theism.
I had a suspicion where this was going. I need to make two small corrections, two small footnotes. One is that I don't, in fact, accept middle knowledge. I'm not sure how Paul got that attributed to me, but that's not right. And the other small footnote is that the translation that Al was using, which has punishment in the text, actually is a mistranslation. During that session, Kelly Clark lent me his computer, and I checked it pretty thoroughly in the Hebrew. It's just a mistranslation. So just to get that out of the way. So as for Bill's question about open theism, I mean, I guess in theory, there's something right about what Bill says, but in my view, there are some things you can know about a person without having middle knowledge and without invoking any kind of circularity of foreknowledge. So, for example, I have one daughter, 3 children and 1 daughter. I love my little daughter to distraction. Now, you might ask yourself this question. If you offer me a nickel to cut up my daughter into 1-inch square cubes of flesh, would I accept that offer? And then you might think to yourself, how would I know? I don't have middle knowledge. How would I know what you do? But that, I really don't. And it's the same way for other things. If you've got pancreatic cancer, and I wonder if feeding you sesame seeds would cure it, well, then, actually, I don't really need middle knowledge to know that won't work. On the basis of what I know about the way the world is, I can know some things are not going to work. And so that's what I would say. For when you've got a deeply entrenched disease, you can know that mild things won't cure it. And that's what I think we got here.
Well, if you know that, so can the God of open theism know that. So we're on an equal basis there, which I think is absolutely the case.
The question was whether I thought my line had to move me in the direction of open theism. The answer to that is no.
Okay, next question. Wait, hold on. There's a huge queue, and I'm starting to forget it. I know he's next. So please bring it. Could people who I've already recognized raise their hand? Oh, okay. Is next. I'm sorry. See, it's after dinner. It's late. Him and then you. Yes, right.
So I have a question for Professor Draper. So Professor Anthony in her talk admitted that moral reasoning is non-monotonic, and it seems plausible to think that moral principles, therefore, are going to be non-monotonic. So they're going to be stated in conditional form, and they're going to be such that adding stuff to the antecedent might make the principle false. And so it seems like here you're invoking a principle, namely that intentionally attempting to eradicate a people is always wrong. And so I think that in a certain circumstance, if you add enough stuff to the antecedent, you might come up with a case where it turns out that the principle is actually false. So here's a somewhat bizarre counterexample, but imagine that through a strange biological mutation, a certain ethnic group, they become vampires, ravenous, ravening vampires, right? And they just start assaulting and killing everyone around them. It seems And suppose that we know that being a member of this ethnic group is highly nomically correlated with being a vampire, right? Suppose actually it's just a necessary connection, right? I mean, this is logically possible, or at least broadly logically possible. So it seems that if the President of the United States were to order the United States Marine Corps to go to wherever this people group is concentrated and just eradicate every last one of them, it's at least not clear to me that that would constitute genocide. So, what do you think?
Actually, yeah, the example I was thinking about was the movie Independence Day, when the aliens come and they're going to, the only way to save humanity is, this may be a little bit different than the story, but say the only way is to destroy the mothership, and suppose that destroys all of these aliens, every last one of them, right? And so then it's in self-defense. And so similarly, like Eleanor, I think, defined murder as killing on your own authority. Well, you might kill on your own authority in self-defense, and we usually wouldn't call that murder then. We might not call this genocide if in that sort of situation.
The justification is, it's part of the thought experiment that God has certain perfections, including moral perfections, and so a being with these perfections would only do things to a people composed of individual persons that were good, that was good for the people, in addition to good for the individual persons, or good for the individual persons, say, individual Amalekites, qua Amalekite, not just qua person, say. I'm wondering if that's right. And if that's right, is the big story, which includes all these little stories, a story about God creating a number of peoples, and the end of the story is there are a number of peoples that have been fully made? Or is it a story about God making one people? Or is there any difference in your mind about those questions?
The first question, where do I get this idea about the Amalekites, is exactly that in the thought experiment, in the putatively possible world of the thought experiment, I stipulated that God has a morally sufficient reason for allowing suffering. So it's just a stipulation in the thought experiment. But I would say, somebody earlier in the Q&A in another session said, you mustn't read this as a Hebrew Bible, you got to read it as a Jewish Bible. You got to read it in light of the Talmud. And I myself think there's a lot of justice in that line. That is, I put it the other way around. If you want to take this story and read it in combination with a worldview alien to the worldview within which the story is, then it can hardly be a surprise if you come up with results contradictory to the religion in question. Why would that be a surprise? It was bound to happen given what you just did. You stirred the incompatible stuff in as you built your interpretation of the story. So that if you want to read this story as something which is a challenge to Christianity or something, well, then you're going to have to read it in the Christian context. And in the Christian context, God is perfectly good. And if he's got perfect goodness, then he must also have a morally sufficient reason for allowing suffering. So that's why the thought experiment goes that way. As I said, if you don't want to do it that way, you can forget about the story of Samuel and the Amalekites. Who cares? Because you got a much weightier reason for rejecting theism. So that's what I would say about that issue. And what does that do in the end? Well, I guess I would say there's pedestrian ways to do things, and then there's elegant ways to do things. So you want to tell a story in a pedestrian way? Tell every last single detail that happened in the story, and who was emptying the trash while it happened, and what the weather was like while it was taking place, and what somebody said about the weather. I mean, that makes for, what do I want to say, inelegant and boring sort of story. But here's what else you can do. tell the salient and interesting parts, and then let those parts stand in a creative way for all the rest. So I would say if you have the story of the way God forms one people, you can extrapolate to how he forms others. And out of that, you can extrapolate to what he's doing with the human species as a whole. So I would say in the story of the Hebrew Bible, it's one period, and at the end, it's still one people. But the one people that it is at the end is every last one of us, the whole human species. That's what the one people is at the end. That's what I'd say.
Okay, yes, that gentleman there, and then it's going to go there, and then there.
Dr. Stump, I just wanted to pursue with you a little bit farther a point that I took Dr. Draper to be making in the concluding lines of his response. It seemed to me that you had an observation of human nature that was fairly essential to your interpretation of this, or your reconstruction of this story, namely that human beings, and I think most people will probably consent to this, human beings often learn best through trial and error, through some sort of experience of their own, dealing with failure, and as a result, learning what will eventually work. My question is, in terms of how that relates to your interpretation of this story, is this coming out of simply your own understanding and perceptions of human nature, or is it that you feel that this was somehow inherent in the understanding of human nature for the authors of this story? Is it necessary, and therefore as a result of whatever will that view be yours or of the original author, is this particular way that God went about instructing and morally improving his chosen people, was this the only way? Was this necessary, given this understanding of human nature, or at least was it the best of possible ways? Because if it's not, it does seem to be a rather terrible alternative.
There are three ways in which you can find evidence for the position that was at issue for me here. One way is anecdotal evidence, your own experience, the experience of others you know. Anecdotal evidence for virtually all of us, I would say, confirms the position. In addition, there's the evidence of the wisdom of cultures. So consider the Greek culture. Greeks had evil gods. They weren't scrambling for cover for philosophy challenges to their religious beliefs. The Greeks held a position of this sort. Aeschylus says, God puts suffering before wisdom. In place of sleep, pain drips black against the heart, and wisdom comes to unwilling mortals through violent grace from the gods who guide the ship. Something like that. Not bad from memory. So there's the wisdom of cultures. But third, guess what? There's a whole field of psychology that studies this issue. It's called post-traumatic growth. It's a burgeoning field in clinical psychology, and there are innumerable studies which demonstrate that after terrible suffering, there is, for human beings, a great increase in what the sufferers themselves perceive as their well-being and what those around the sufferer perceive as a kind of rejuvenation of life for the sufferer. In the 1990s, somebody did studies of breast cancer survivors and found, to the astonishment of the researchers, that an overwhelming number of breast cancer survivors reported what the psychologists have come to call adversarial growth or post-traumatic growth. And then the psychologist went out to see if the results would hold up in other areas. And the list of things the psychologist went on to study is really bizarre. Maritime disasters, kidnapping, sexual assault. I mean, it's just a bizarre collection of things that they went out to find, and they discovered that the result holds good for all those disasters. And now, adversarial growth or post-traumatic growth is a growth area in clinical psychology as the psychologists continue to study what this is, why it works, how it happens, and what they say, which seems to me hilarious, is they say philosophers have known for years, for decades, for centuries, that suffering is how you get to the really good stuff for human beings. I would say they don't live in the same world I do, but that's what those guys think. So that's the evidence base.
Okay, next question is over here. And then over there, and then, well, how strict do you want to be?
I say we're done already.
Where are we?
Give it 10. And then...
Okay. No point raising your hand anymore. There are too many people in the queue. Okay.
Professor Draper, you raised a complaint that I've heard once or twice else in this conference, which is that basically the Bible is written in a misleading way or not very well. So specifically in your case, what you're talking about is where God gives this rationale for his command to exterminate Amalek, and that's very different from the rationale that Stump attributes to God. And so you say, look, basically the Bible could have been written better, or it's misleading, or people, well, not you have said this, but other people have said in future centuries, people have interpreted this Bible or interpreted these passages to the detriment of, whatever. This criticism seems weak to me for the reason that almost any text, probably any text, is open to lots of different interpretations. And no matter how God, divinely inspired or otherwise, writes the text, there's going to be issues of interpretation. So, for example, consider the Constitution, which is a much simpler document. Everyone here knows that the Constitution is open to endless interpretation, except for the passages that say things like you must be 35 to run for president. And I'll bet if we dug, we could even find controversial interpretations of that. So, given that the Constitution is open to these difficult interpretive problems, the Bible certainly is. So, the fact that you find it misleading, okay, that's nice, but not that strong.
Well, I never said that I thought that passage was misleading, right? I mean, I took it that on Professor Stump's interpretation, you would have to assume that it was that God did a very poor job of explaining his command. I think that passage is quite clear. I mean, in terms of the general point about interpretation, I mean, there is some limitations based on the text, right? There's some limitations. And the limitations go beyond, it's not enough just to say, to be able to write a T, true, next to every sentence in the story for that to be a plausible interpretation. So I think actually in that story, it's quite clear. I mean, what God is saying he's doing. Even, again, I agree with Professor Stump I shouldn't say that the experts that I talk to, because I don't know anything about this, might agree that you shouldn't translate that as punishment. And that's why I said only the suggestion of punishment was strong, but not irresistible. But one thing that is clear is that what's going on is that God is responding. He is destroying Amalek because of what Amalek did to Israel. Notice this isn't a case of destroying the Amalekites themselves for something to do with the Amalekites. It's about the people, right? The people, Amalek. Amalek is the whole tribe, right? And it did something to Israel as Israel came out of Egypt. And because of what it did, now Amalek, not the Amalekites, of course, in order to destroy Amalek, the Amalekites are getting in trouble. But nevertheless, the point is, I'm going to do something now to Amalek because of that. And so my point was that then to suggest that what's really going on there, and she said that the rationale that God wants to reveal to us through the story, has more to do with Israel. And even with respect to the Amalekites, it probably has to do with their present transgressions. It certainly has more to do with the Amalekites than it does with Amalek, the people. So that's my point. I think that story is quite fairly clear, not misleading.
I'd actually much rather listen to Eleanor recite some more poetry, but my question is for Professor Draper. This last bit you say at the very end, I think this is going to hold regardless of whether or not Eleanoresian Christianity is committed to middle knowledge or not. You say, of course, it's logically possible that a God like this has no better way to achieve his goal of forming Israel in that way, but wildly implausible. And my question is,
right.
How are you going to go about assigning the probability distribution here? Not just like, in the following sense, because I take it her point isn't that, her point is that, first of all, the goal of forming Israel isn't the only goal involved in God's acting in the biblical story and in the story, the way God acts with the Amalekites. So first of all, they're all there, whatever God's goals is with them. And even if we can give this sort of general account of what God's goal is, forming people that are prepared for union with him, I take it that's merely a part, consistent part, but a part of a very long, complicated goal that God has in creation and acting in the world. A story, a goal that I take it as traditional accounts very much beyond our kin. If we start, packing some of that skeptical theism talk into this, how do we get that it's, though possible, wildly implausible that this was sort of the best way God could go about doing it?
Omnipotence. Oh, you want more? Well, I'm not going to try and assign a specific probability distribution. I don't know why you would think I would try to do something like that. But yeah, exceedingly remote. Yeah, I got the exceedingly remote line actually from an episode of Star Trek. But anyways, Data would say something. Well, the chances are exceedingly remote. So I thought, that's a good line. I'll use that. But no, look, imagine the idea that of an omnipotent being and all the different ways that being could possibly influence Israel for union with himself, right? The chances that it would actually have to do something like this, use just ordering Israel. Generally speaking, it's not all that plausible to think that that's going to be the best way to get people to reform by ordering them to commit genocide. Now I know, in fairness to Eleanor, she had a line about how that might work, but an omnipotent being has so many resources, can try and influence in so many different ways, affect the person's, and whatever effects on the person's basic motivational structure, like their desires to do certain things, or their beliefs that influence what they might do, what they might freely choose to do. Those things could be done directly. They don't have to go through this long story of suffering, right? Of suffering and changing the beliefs and the desires. You could directly change the Israelites' people's desires. Whatever effect that command and carrying out that command had on their motivational structure, on their beliefs or desires, could be duplicated in another way by an omnipotent being. So it's really, it strikes me, I doubt it's even possible, but even if it is possible, that's why I thought it was so extremely remote.
I would like to comment on that. I would like to say that what Professor Draper just said makes my point, in two ways. In two ways. I said that unless you watched it in action, you would think we don't need any of this stuff. God could do it by some easier way. Obviously, omnipotence could. That's what he just said. And what I said is that's what we would believe unless you watched him try out thing after thing after thing and found it to fail. So what I actually said was not that he succeeds by what he does with Samuel and the Amalekites, but that he fails. And as for the last suggestion of Professor Draper's, that God could do it by directly acting on the will of a human being, I covered that in my talk. And what I said is, if what you want is union, you can get union only if you've got two wills. If you've got just one will, you don't get union.
No.
So if God puts his will into you, what's in you is his will, then he can unite with his will, but he can't unite with yours because you haven't got one anymore.
No, well, I wasn't denying that there was still free choice, right? Affecting the strength of your desires or the beliefs that you have, your evaluative judgments, there's still then left the free choice to do, in other words, whatever effect commanding the Amalekites to slaughter, commanding the Israelites to slaughter the Amalekites had, that could be duplicated any effect on their desires or their evaluative judgments could be duplicated, still giving them the free will, so that it's still their own will, so there's still two wills.
If you have a teenage daughter and you affect her desires in some limited way and leave her free will, she can still spit in your eye. And if you arrange it so she can't do that anymore, then it's your will in her and not her will. So I would say whichever way you go here, you're going to...
That's a false dichotomy.
Yeah, well, okay.
Well, this sounds, I'm afraid, I've been ordered by one of the Michaelian Trinity members to cut things off, and so we have to thank our speakers. Thank you very much.